Let's get started. It's 3:02. Thank you guys for joining us today. We are so excited to be here for this webinar on how to get a high-tech job in a low-tech way. You might know from the title a little bit about what's coming, but our presenter today is Robert Coombs. Thank you for coming and being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks especially for coming in person in front of our blue wall. It makes everything just a little more personal.
I'm excited to see what kind of CGI ends up behind me.
We are not that sophisticated yet. So Robert's going to talk a little bit about his job search, which actually ended just a week or two ago.
Yep.
Robert's now COO of a very cool up-and-coming company in New York City, but he spent the last 4 months before that applying or having something or someone apply on his behalf to over 3,000 jobs. And we thought that this could be a really good opportunity to share with all of you guys a little bit about Robert's approach, what worked, what didn't work, and how he ultimately found his job.
Great.
So I'm actually going to slide out of the frame and leave it to you to take it away, and maybe I'll be back for some questions.
Sounds good.
Cool.
Can you help me get the... well, thank you. I really appreciate the chance to be here. This is a really interesting community for me to be talking to, in part because you're much more skilled at the thing that I tried to do than I am. I made an attempt to use technology to scale the job search process. And ultimately what you're going to hear is that I failed. I think there's an interesting story along the way, but the lessons that were learned, both for me as an individual and also for the kinds of companies that are out there recruiting, that's what's led to some really interesting dialogues, and that's what I'm going to tell you about. So first, I'll just say that earlier this year I faced a huge transition. I was working at a national nonprofit, and I was overseeing several teams. I built them from the ground up, and so in my case, I'd hired and trained dozens of people across a bunch of different areas. I had worked with web, IT, government affairs, editorial, and public relations. And that's the sort of experience that I was sort of blessed with coming from the nonprofit world. It's also something that's really hard to achieve in lots of other industries. And so I kind of thought that I had a pretty good chance as I transitioned out of that nonprofit world. I was particularly interested in coming to the tech industry, a place that you all have been thinking about where you're going to be landing, perhaps in the not too distant future. The last time I had applied to jobs, it was a pretty straightforward process. You find a job announcement, you submit a resume and a cover letter, you sort of tweak them to the company you're applying to, and then you just wait to hear back. So that's what I did. In my case, I started applying to companies like Google and Facebook and Slack, because these are the types of companies that I'd always imagined myself landing at. I was leaving a perfectly good job, and I was doing it voluntarily. I'd had really successful teams, and I was tremendously proud of them. But the thing was, companies like this, it started to seem, as I applied to more and more positions, it started to seem like they just didn't have the same value for my experience that I thought that they would. So I started applying to more and more of these positions, and as the applications stacked up, I realized a couple of things. Number one, I wasn't getting a whole lot of outcome. I wasn't getting calls from companies like this. I wasn't getting interviews. And number two, I was doing a lot of the exact same work over and over and over again. If you go to any of the big career websites, they tell you the same thing. Tweak your resume, add in the right keywords, make sure you're highlighting the sorts of skills and outcomes that are specific to the job that you're applying to, and then do the same thing to your cover letter. But as I started to speak with people in the HR industry, they kind of let me know that there was probably something else happening, something else at play here. And they started telling me about these systems called applicant tracking systems. I'm going to refer to them as an ATS, but an applicant tracking system is simply a database of jobs and applicants. And the more sophisticated versions of them have these automated filters that search through cover letters and resumes for keywords, specific educational background, and work experience. Now, filter is nothing new to this audience. We apply them all the time. But a couple of things that are particularly interesting to me is when I think about how we structure filters, it's really critical that the person who's creating that filter knows both what the data look like before they're being filtered and what the data ought to look like after they're being filtered. If the person who's building that filter doesn't know, then they actually create a structure that is systematic in eliminating data that they might actually want to see. And you all can imagine the different ways in which that can be problematic. So here I've sort of shown a little bit of a visualization for a data set, and it's all jumbled up in different colors and shapes. But if we apply a pretty straightforward filter like red and circle, we know what's going to happen, right? There's some data that's going to show itself and other data that won't. And so when I was speaking to these HR colleagues of mine, they explained to me that the filters that are being created for these applicant tracking systems, they're really intending to identify the most skilled applicants. They're intending to identify people for whom there's going to be a strong culture fit, but they don't necessarily have the sort of actuarial data to know that the filters that they're applying are going to be effective. They also don't necessarily know what the data set that they're filtering looks like before applying this filter. And so as a result, you can imagine that you have these folks that are wielding an incredibly powerful tool, and they don't necessarily know how broadly those cuts are being. The applicant tracking system in this case is a robot that's taking instruction from someone who may or may not fully understand the impact of the data filters that they're applying. And in this case, the ones that they tend to focus on are education, work experience, and what I call a buzzword salad. The thing is, you know, when we think about people that are really successful in their jobs, rarely do we say they were successful exclusively because they went to this university or exclusively because they worked at this competitor. And especially, rarely are they successful because they had these keywords in their resume. We all know, even though it's not the right thing to do, it's very, very easy to throw some keywords into your resume because you had some sort of tangential experience with them, not necessarily because you're an expert in them. And yet, from the perspective of hiring managers and recruiters, this is the way that they're filtering us out. So it led me to start asking some questions. If I knew that this system was being put in place to filter me out, how could I reverse engineer that and use it in a way that worked to my advantage? In some cases, I wasn't the best candidate, so it wasn't a bad thing that I was being filtered out. But in some cases, I felt like my experience was probably exactly what that company would want if only they got a chance to see me. And I was guessing that they weren't actually getting a chance to see me because these filters were knocking me out before I had the chance to get in. So with this in mind, knowing that at the very least I was an unconventional candidate, but at least maybe a pretty interesting candidate for some of the jobs that I was looking at, how was I going to go about solving this problem? Well, like many of you, I like to apply technology to complicated problems. And so I did the only reasonable thing that a person like me can do, and that is to fight fire with fire. I decided that if they were going to use a robot to filter me out, I was going to use a robot to force my way in. Now, of course, that's not necessarily a reasonable thing, but when you think about the kinds of companies that I was really interested in, I sure thought that on the one hand, it would give me a fighting chance, just a chance to get in front of them and have that conversation. And on the other hand, it might actually showcase some of the skills that I have that would be interesting to a group like that. I'm not a developer, but I needed to make sure that I was demonstrating I understood technology well enough to use it for effect. So I'll tell you what that looked like, and I'll tell you this audience is very different than some of the other audiences I've explained this to. You won't be thoroughly impressed by the technology. In fact, I've had a number of developers reach out to me and tell me all of the ways that they could do it better. But I think that you'll appreciate the lesson that I learned in here. So I built this Rube Goldbergian contraption of web crawlers and spreadsheets and scripts that automate this process. Now remember, before I was going out and searching the web, step one, identifying jobs that were interesting and specific to me, step two, and then grabbing one of a number of different resumes that I had that were specific to that, step three, and then writing a customized and personalized cover letter that was specific to the job, to the company, and to the hiring manager, step four. So I created as best as I could, a system that would automate each of these four steps. A web crawler that was going out and looking for jobs based on certain keywords. It would bring them all in together into a spreadsheet and then sort them into different titles and types of companies. This is step two, organizing them along specific variables. Then it's selected based on the title and the type of company. It's selected amongst a bunch of different resumes that I had customized to particular types of jobs. And then the last thing that it would do is pass all this stuff through a series of sheets until I could parse out the company name, in many cases the hiring manager's name, the title, and a few specific items from that job posting. And of course, you're already guessing what I'm doing with that stuff. Each of those are becoming variables that I'm using to customize the cover letter. So I'm going into a little bit more depth with you guys on this, in part because I think that you can sort of see the system being broken down into steps. And you see that while, again, I'm not a developer, I like to think of myself as trying to tackle these problems in the way that other technologists might. That's kind of the way that my brain is shaped. So how did it do? Well, I can tell you that it was ruthlessly efficient, but it was a little bit sloppy. The very first time I ran this, I went downstairs, went across the street, and I got a cup of coffee, and I came back, and I noticed that I had inadvertently applied to more than 1,300 jobs in the Midwest. Now we're broadcasting here from New York City, so you can imagine the shock, horror, when I realized I had accidentally applied to more than 1,000 jobs in places that I had no intention of moving to. But it did show me that this was at least a rapidly scalable version of my job search. And other things seemed to be working correctly, so all I needed to do was dial in the location of these jobs, and I could maybe get some interesting results. So, you know, the first step is that you get these applications out there, and then the second step is you start getting responses. And whereas I had been experienced with having a trickle of responses, I might apply to dozens of jobs before I really landed an interview. I expected that this was going to transform my job search from a trickle into a fire hose. And certainly, given the 1,300 jobs that I had accidentally applied to, once it was actually aimed in the right direction, I was really expecting to have an impact. The thing is, though, after thousands of applications had gone out, I'd seen no better results in the large and well-known companies than I saw when I was applying to jobs manually. Virtually no success, just a whole lot more of it. Now, I already explained that I had been customizing these resumes and cover letters in just the same way I would if I was applying to jobs one at a time. I was just doing it en masse. And so I realized that there was still an opportunity for refining this. Now, instead of writing every single cover letter from scratch or tweaking each individual variable, I could do this in a much larger scale. Now I could also start using other tools in my technology toolkit and refine this even more, but with the same effort that I was putting in before. So I made sure that I added into this system both the ability to run A/B tests and the ability, in order for those A/B tests to work, I would also need to be able to track the outcomes of each application that was going in. So I figured that, all right, maybe this is just that the campaign hasn't been refined enough, that I'm not getting a whole lot of responses. Now I'm going to take a little bit of a side trip here just for a second, because it's important to note that the job search process is this really personal, difficult time. The longer it goes on, the more you start questioning yourself. I talked to some colleagues of mine that are in psychology, and they started talking about this is actually a real thing, that people that are searching for jobs often deal with depression. The rejection that you go through in any part of your life can have a real impact on your self-image, and it's hard to get your hopes up after a while. So if you think that it's tough to be positive when you're applying for jobs and they're not coming through, or you get your hopes up about a job and you're not coming through, just imagine the way in which applying to 3,000 jobs and not getting through. Imagine how that impacts your outlook on life. In my case, I had always heard that robots had the potential to take our jobs, but it was really striking that when I put one together myself, the result would be that it could bum me out on an epic scale. It was less helpful than it was a little bit saddening. Nevertheless, I decided that this was only a matter of time, and the more I refined my campaign, as it were, the better I would do. And so you see here a version of, it says A version. This is one version. I call this the A version. There's also a B version. So this is one of the versions that I use for A/B tests. And you can see hiring manager, position title, skills matched, all of those things are the variables that get plugged in to this customized cover letter. But I was really interested after a while in seeing, since it didn't really matter how I changed the campaign, it didn't matter, I tried all sorts of different versions, and it didn't really have a significant impact on the outcomes. Sometimes I'd see a percent here or a couple percent there, but overall it wasn't really enough to make a huge difference. And so I started to suspect that there was something else happening. I thought maybe there was a chance that nobody was reading this at all, that I was sending out thousands of these emails or applying to thousands of positions, and nobody was really paying attention to the thing that I was spending all of my time focused on, which is that sort of personalization, customization that we're trained to do. So I ran a different kind of A/B test. The A version that I ran was just like many others that I'd run before, and the B version was a little bit different. After the very first paragraph, indeed after the very first sentence, I included a sign in there that shows right, clear as day, that this was not your typical application. And in this case, it said that the email or the application was being submitted by a robot. Now, many of you should be thinking, okay, there's no way that cover letter is going to work. Or maybe some of you are thinking, that's a really cool cover letter. I bet that surprised some people. Well, to tell you the truth, it didn't matter to me which of those were the case. I wanted to know if someone was reading this cover letter at all. If it made them happy and they said, I really like the cut of this guy's jib, I want to hire him, let's bring him in for an interview. Or if they said, who the heck does this guy think he is? What audacity to not even bother to apply on his own. He has this robot that's doing it for him. But those of you who are with me in knowing that it's all about what the data tells us, know that it really didn't matter either one of these. As long as I could see a huge difference between one or the other, then I knew that human beings were really a part of this system. And it turns out they're not. In my case, again, in some of the largest companies, certainly not true across the board. Some small companies are looking at these, and I did get a lot of responses from smaller companies. But in my case, in the bigger and more well-known companies, nobody was reading cover letters. And since I knew that these applications were going into ATS, or applicant tracking systems, I could also say that even the robots weren't reading these cover letters. Interestingly enough, and I don't have the data on this in front of me, but I remember at one point going in and taking a look at the number of emails that got caught by spam filters. And it turned out that my B version, remember the one that said it was being sent by a robot, it turns out that that actually got through spam filters more frequently. So the only thing that was actually effective is admitting that a person wasn't applying. You can make all sorts of guesses about the future of AI and whether or not robots will like us as much as they like each other. I went on to start asking HR managers and recruiters about this, and they said, listen, of course we're using these filters to sort out applicants. In one case, I talked to a recruiter at Spotify, and he told me that they get between 300 and 350,000 applicants a year. So it really shouldn't surprise us at all that they're using, as much as I'm using something like a brute force approach to trying to get my way in, they have to use a brute force approach to filter us out. It's the only reasonable thing that they could be doing. But it led me to ask that question: how do I get my foot in the door here if they're using these technologies to keep me out? I talked to other folks who told me that 80 to 90% of jobs are never even posted at the senior levels. And in many companies, as many as 30 to 50% of hires come from referrals. And that's interesting because in those companies, in many of those cases, they pay as much as tens of thousands of dollars for a person who refers a candidate who goes on to accept the job. So they're really incentivizing their own staff to go out and find other staff. But nowhere in there are you hearing about the ways in which they're spending more staff time to go through the people who've applied through the traditional methods. In fact, referrals can be up to 4 times more likely to be hired than candidates who apply through traditional means. So if that's the case, first of all, we really need to ask ourselves, are companies doing the best job they can of recruiting if they're offering us multiple channels to apply, but they're really only attending to 1 or 2 of those? But the flip side of that is, are we as candidates doing the best job that we can to put ourselves out there if we're focusing on the channels that we know aren't having the most impact? I started to learn other dirty little secrets about the recruiting process through this project. And so some folks told me things like, one person said, I don't even look at people that apply to jobs anymore. I only consider people that I find by hunting on LinkedIn. That was really striking to me. This person admitted that they don't even consider folks who actively self-select as interested in their company and interested in that role and take the time to actually apply. And instead they go chasing after people who are already gainfully employed and who've shown no interest whatsoever in their company. In other cases, I spoke with recruiters and realized that I was applying to jobs that don't even exist. Someone told me that they post positions to job boards that don't exist yet, but with the idea that they want to create a pipeline of candidates so that when and if they do hire those positions, they've got a huge data set that they can just jump right on. Well, this was, as you can imagine, pretty disappointing because I'd been applying to jobs that didn't exist and trying to squeeze through filters that are built to keep someone like me out. and competing with people who've worked with their competitors and who are friends with their employees, who are getting referred in directly. And let's not forget, perhaps more than any candidate that you've ever known, now I was real sad. It's not necessarily the end of the story, though, because I learned a lot about the job search process. I learned a lot about what recruiters face and the tools that they use and the systems that they create in order to find us. So what are the lessons that I learned? Well, first, it's not how you apply, it's who you know. And if you don't know someone, you might not want to bother. Second, the number of jobs that you apply to has no correlation to whether or not you'll be considered. And don't forget, you definitely won't be considered for the jobs that you don't get the chance to apply to because they're never listed. So what are the odds of getting a job by going the traditional route? As I talked to more and more recruiters, I found out that jobs can have anywhere from 40 to 250 applicants, and in some cases many more. I saw some positions that got literally thousands of applicants. The talent teams are going through their own process in order to figure out how they sort those folks out. And maybe you see yourself in this picture somewhere and you're trying to figure out, how do I get to the front of the line? Well, the process that they go through, the typical order of precedence that I heard time and time again, was they look at referrals, they look at candidates that were proactively sourced, so those are the folks that they're actually hunting on LinkedIn and in other places. Then they go and look at the candidates who applied directly through their career site. And last, they go and look at candidates that applied through the job board. Now again, this is a general rule. It's not necessarily the case across the board, but more often than not, I heard that this was the order of priority when sorting through big, long lists of candidates. Well, you can sort of see that these are two different groups of candidate pools. The first group here, I like to think of as a group in which I have almost no control. I have no ability to get myself into that group without someone else's help. And the second group is the one and only group that I can control myself. I can control where I apply and when I apply. But the question is, if this is the order in which they actually go through candidate pools, which group do you want to be in? Where do you want to land, and where do you want to focus your time? You know, I mentioned earlier the huge volume of applicants that are coming in, but that was the total number of applicants. It turns out there's a much smaller group of applicants that are not going in through the front door and instead are finding other approaches. And so that first group that I mentioned there, referrals and proactive sourcing, is the one that I decided I wanted to target. So referrals are gained exactly how you would guess. You go out and you talk to your network and you ask them to connect you with people who are in a company or a role that you're interested in. And I'll tell you that I've had roughly the same number of interviews from networking and networking with just a handful of key contacts that I have from having a bot that applies to thousands of jobs. So we're literally saying here that simple networking, old school, word of mouth, chatting people up at cocktail parties and going to networking events is literally hundreds and hundreds of times more effective than submitting unsolicited applications or hitting a click here to apply button. Another way that I decided to target those top two options was to get proactively sourced. And for me, that meant going out and telling my story. This was a fun project that I took on. I started out thinking I would get a job through it, and really quickly realized that this was just not the way that I was going to be found by recruiters. But I did have this really interesting data set. I did have these interviews that I had conducted with people in the field who could tell me what was going on behind the curtains. And so I decided to tell that story. And some of you have read that story. It was featured in Fast Company earlier this year. And through telling my story, just a few things happened. First, within maybe a month or a month and a half, nearly 200 other candidates reached out and told me that they shared similar frustrations and experiences. And that was really validating. I also had dozens of HR tech companies reach out to me. And since then, in fact, over the last 4 to 6 months or so, I've worked with most of those companies. I've either spoken at all-hands meetings or worked with their CEOs. In some cases, I'm advising those companies. Now, these are the very same companies that didn't notice me when I was applying on their very own website. But when I totally ignored them and went the other direction and just told an interesting story, all of a sudden they started seeking me out. You heard earlier that my job search ended recently. I'm really excited that I've had the opportunity to join a team called The Class. This is a fitness and lifestyle brand. I'm the new Chief Operating Officer, and this is a role that did not exist before I started having conversations with the company. The way that I came to this company was by good old-fashioned networking. A friend of mine knew the president of the company and said that they needed a little bit of help in an area that I'm pretty good at. And it turns out that this friend of mine I only met because I had written that article. So this is really a case in point of an opportunity that never existed before me trying to target those top 2 areas of the list of priorities that recruiters have. Since then, I've gotten a bunch of other opportunities. I've gotten to share my ideas with lots of different audiences. Recently participated in an event called 10-10-10, in which 10 prospective CEOs get an opportunity to try and solve big, hairy problems facing cities. So now it's not just the folks in the tech industry, it's entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, cities, and other industries that I really didn't have that much experience in, but by seeing that I had an interesting approach to problem solving, all of a sudden all these different opportunities pop up. And some of you also got a chance to see the TEDx talk that I gave, which was a really fun opportunity to share this story. And again, opened up a whole lot of other conversations and continues to this day. Now, that's obviously, this story is riddled with success bias. There's lots of folks out there who can't go out and build a bot that applies to thousands of jobs, or perhaps they're smart enough not to. There's folks that maybe writing isn't their strong suit and they don't have an interesting story to tell. But what can you do? Well, remember, this started out as just a fun project. It was something that I felt like it would have a good opportunity of shaving some time off my job search, but it was never intended to be the sort of thing that would lead to me doing a webinar with a group like you. These are all very lucky outcomes of me getting out there and doing something that I was really interested in, diving in deep and sharing my story. The other thing that I've done is take advantage, and especially if you're in the New York area, but I imagine this is true in lots and lots of other cities, take advantage of all the networking opportunities that are out there. There is literally not a single day of the week in which you can't go out in New York City and join a networking event that's specifically focused on the technology industry. And I've met a lot of really fantastic people. In fact, I've gotten some good consulting work out of that. And now that I'm not on the job hunt, I spend my time, when I do attend these events, I spend my time pointing out to other really talented people that I know about. So that networking, you really never know what's going to come of it, even if it means that you're going to meet someone who goes on to another networking event and mentions your name. I guess that's the happy ending to this story. I think that you all have a really interesting set of resources here at the Flatiron School, and I'll take this opportunity to welcome Rebekah back, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about how this story connects to those.
Cool. Can you see my face?
Yes.
Cool. Should we unshare the slides? Yeah.
Yeah. There we go.
Great. Okay. Oh, now we can see. Just a full conversation. I love this story, and obviously I love this story. As you guys may or may not know, or those of you who know me may have just assumed, we found Robert and asked him to do this webinar because we read his blog post and thought that it was such an interesting case in point about the value of networking and what really happens with your job application when you apply cold on a website. So I have a couple questions in the context of kind of what we do here and our graduates and the job searches that they're either in or are going to be in. You talked a lot about not getting the door through applications and kind of going this very circuitous route to getting the conversations that really ended up fruitful for you. What was missing in your online, like assuming it even got seen at all, what was missing in the online communication through an application that you were able to communicate through a one-on-one interaction?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I guess this is the place where it's worth pointing out that it's possible that some of the people watching right now wouldn't need to go through such a circuitous route because their resume is exactly what an employer is looking for. That was not the case for me. I came from the world of nonprofit and politics, and so what was missing is that when I'm applying to a company like Google, they want to see that I worked at Twitter. When I apply at Twitter, they want to see that I worked at Facebook. And then that's just the big ones. Even when you get down into startups, they really want to see .coms behind your name at most of the middle and senior levels. So if you don't already have a pedigree that screams technology or startup or any of these things, then it's an uphill climb. It's really, really tough to convince people to take, to pick you out of a group of, upwards of 250 people and say, I want to spend some time with this person who hasn't worked at any of our competitors, didn't go to the schools that I think of when I think of, really successful people in my industry. And so that's what was missing on paper. Now, hopefully, having listened to a story like this, you can see that if I can get in front of someone, I can explain, I've got an analytical mind, I've got a pretty big tool set that you might not imagine for someone with a communications and operations background. And I just think differently, and that's the way that I work and the way that I lead. That's a much easier conversation to have with a hiring manager. They can figure out where they can put you, even if it's not something that they're plugging into their filters.
So I guess I'm going to ask a bit of a deeper question on that. We talk here a lot about transferable skills, because when students are successful, when they get in front of employers and are able to articulate the precise way in which their marketing background is going to be valuable as an engineer to that marketing tech company, which you might think that's obvious from a resume or a cover letter, but we've seen the most success with students who can get in front of employers and talk about that. How do you find the right way to talk about your transferable skills, and how do you know who to tell that story to?
Well, I think the first thing that you need to do is translate those skills for yourself. And in fact, I've learned a lot from you about how to do this, even in my own case. I think you need to have a sounding board and say, so this is what I think I do. How do you hear that in your language? And through that process, you'll learn not only what to highlight, but what words to use to explain it. Then you tell it to everyone who will listen. In my case, again, as a communications person, I think about a lot of different audiences, and I try to speak to them differently. So I might speak to a recruiter a little bit differently than the hiring manager if the hiring manager is an expert in a particular area, but this recruiter is just looking to get a body in and talk to them. I might speak to the recruiter in ways that make them feel like they feel confident putting me in front of the hiring manager, but not necessarily get into the weeds of the skills. Mm-hmm. And then with the hiring manager, really start talking about those transferable skills in their language. Again, trying to really learn how to translate that into someone else's language. If you're already coming from the same industry, there's not necessarily as much translation, but you still need to figure out what translates from whatever your last post was to your next post. I've got sort of I think, an interesting story on this. I've done a lot of work with the Navy. This is in a past life. And I was out on an aircraft carrier once, and on the deck, and I was interviewing a young sailor who was literally steering the ship. He may have been 20 years old, and he said, I asked, how long does it take for this thing to stop? And he said, about 5 miles. And I said, so you must be a really good driver. And he said, I'm an excellent driver. I said, well, so it turns out that 20-year-olds, they don't necessarily, they haven't fully developed their ability to plan long in advance. So how do you, when you leave here, how do you tell people about the fact that if you didn't do your job right, this aircraft carrier lands in downtown San Diego? And he said, I don't know. I'm just going to tell them that I steered the ship. And I went back, and it really kind of rocked me. And since then, I've spoken to folks in the Navy who do just this. They actually help young sailors explain the skills that they have when they go out into the real world. Because you know what? There's not a lot of jobs for driving aircraft carriers out in the real world. That's a young man who needs to know how to translate that into the kind of language that I, as a hiring manager, might want. The ability to plan, the ability to forecast, the ability to make decisions under pressure. That's how you translate those kinds of skills, and that's really useful.
And so throughout your whole narrative, you talked about basically the fact that articulating these transferable skills when you're not precisely what the filters are looking for is easiest in these sort of like non-traditional, more complex communications, blog posts and talks and one-on-one networking, word-of-mouth referrals. If you could go back to your 5 months ago self and start your job search over, what would you focus on? What would you do?
I mean, I would be foolish if I said that I would just do things over the same way. That being said, it's been a really fun ride. I think I really lucked out. I definitely, if I could go back, maybe not to my 5 months ago self, but my 12 months ago self, when I first started thinking about other types of jobs, I definitely would not have just jumped on LinkedIn and started clicking here to apply now. It's really funny, even with as much as I know about how ineffective that is. I still do it. It's so enticing, and every single time I do, I sort of kick myself. I feel like I'm the economist who still goes out and buys lottery tickets, even though he knows that it's a really bad investment. But the job search is one that is marketed to us. Those buttons are just so enticing, and it seems so frictionless. And like, hey, what is there to lose except for, over the course of your entire job search, hours and hours and lots of hope. And it was kind of wasted hope, because I can tell you, I don't think, for as many times as I've clicked here to apply now, I don't think a single one of those has ever panned out. But I've never gone to a networking event in which I didn't have really interesting conversations, and I didn't, either learn that there's an opportunity for me and there's someone that I can go and talk to, or that there's no opportunity for me. That's also really, really valuable, is to just connect with people and find out the companies that you don't want to be at, or the positions that you're not yet ready for.
Yeah. And it sounds like, you talked a little bit about kind of getting sad and like, click to apply, no one responds, you get sad. You click to apply 3,000 times, you're like epically sad. Yeah. And I think it can be really enticing to get yourself that little hit of dopamine by clicking click here to apply, and you feel, I've done something. But as you say, you know that doesn't work. The hit of dopamine is still so enticing. So if you know that this isn't going to work, but it's one of the easiest ways to get that little hit of dopamine, but you want to do something more productive, what did you do during this process that filled your own well and gave you energy to kind of be positive and restore your hope and excitement?
So, well, I mean, first of all, it wasn't until it was probably too late that I realized what a bummer this is. I mean, you really, like, when you're just doing it one at a time, you see a cool job, you're like, oh, that is so cool. And look, I'm qualified for it. I've got all the skills. Like, this is a perfect fit. I'm really excited about it. You either click here to apply now, or you build out like a full, you do it the right way, the traditional way. It wasn't until I did that a lot of times that I realized, I started questioning myself and all these things. And I looked back at my previous success in a different industry and thought, like, was that a fluke? And, I started talking to old colleagues and saying, listen, I'm having a really tough time here. What do you think's going on? And one day I was talking to my fiance, who's the most incredibly supportive person in the entire world. And she looked at me and she's like, are you stupid? Nobody gets a job by applying on a website. Everybody gets a job by networking. And it was like this, she was saying it like it was so obvious. And a lot of people, in fact, have said in almost the same tone that very thing. And that's when I stopped and I realized, like, oh my God, not only is this what my experience shows, it's what the data shows. And it's the one thing that I'm not out there doing right now. I'm spending hours scouring the internet for maybe a job that just got posted so I can be the first applicant and all these things. They're not looking at the first applicant that comes through. The first applicant's as valuable as the 250th, as long as it goes through the filter. Yeah. And it was that, that very sort of tough love conversation that made me realize I just needed to throw this entire thing out and start from scratch and think about where I can have a real impact in my chances. And that was by going through that side route, that side door.
So you went through the side door, you met the friend who introduced you to the president of the class.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about how that process played out?
Yeah, and it wasn't the only one. In fact, I had a really tough decision not too long ago. I had a couple of opportunities. One that was in exactly the kind of company that I'd always wanted to be a part of. It's in the tech industry. I was the head of communications for a company that I have a lot of admiration for. But by the time I got to that place where I started to have these job offers that were in sort of a VP of communications or head of communications, I realized I had already grown out of that role. I'd learned so much. My networking, through networking alone, I had learned an incredible amount about lots of different industries. The networking led to consulting work, which wasn't necessarily a job, but I was sort of treating it as an opportunity to extend my runway. Really what was happening is I was learning to be a much better internal advocate for process. I was speaking directly with CEOs and helping them to analyze their entire business models. And before long, I started thinking, like, this isn't the sort of thing that a communications guy does. This is really a much bigger role. And so I can genuinely say that it was through my job search process that I actually grew out of my old job. And so a venture capitalist who I'd come to know during this time was connected to someone, and he was part of my networking process. I had come to know him. I took him out for coffee, sort of talked to him about what I did. I actually asked him to help me translate my own skills. I said, you talk to companies like this all the time. How would you say what I do? And he's like, yeah, get rid of all of this stuff, PR and all these things. Here's what you're really good at. And he said it to me, and I was like, yeah, you're right. That is what I'm good at. A few weeks later, he emailed me, and he said, would you like to be the chief operating officer of this company? And I said, absolutely not. I have no experience whatsoever in that industry. He said, well, at least talk to them. They're doing really great stuff, and I think that they could use someone with your background. So I went in and I did a little bit of consulting work with them. And they really are an incredible group of folks who've accomplished a great deal with a very small team. The thing that they needed was someone who could help them scale their organization. And I've spent the last 6 months talking to organizations that are trying to scale. They're trying to refine their product offering. They're trying to figure out the DNA of their organization. And it turns out that after a few weeks of doing this kind of work, with this company, they said, okay, now we really, really want to talk to you about coming on board. And so it was very organic, the way that happened. And I think that's really what you should be looking for on the networking side, not trying to force it. I knew pretty quickly that it was a company I'd love to work for, but I had a job to do, and it's to really help them understand these things that I was focused on in the project. And it turns out, when people see you doing something that you love, that you're really good at, the jobs will follow. I mean, I hate to say, if you build it, they will come. But this really was a chief operating officer role that did not exist until they saw someone doing the kind of work that a chief operating officer would do, and that's when they invented the role to bring me on.
That is pretty cool. It's two of my favorite job search adages, one of which is, if you ask people for a job, they'll give you advice. If you ask people for advice, eventually they will give you a job.
That's really well stated.
And about building value for a company, even before you're employed, even before you have an offer in hand, which probably give you a lot more leverage when you're talking to the end of your process.
Yeah. No, that's that's absolutely right, and I really like the way that you said that, because my approach to networking was to take as many people out as I could and to just learn from them. And it sounds like a little bit manipulative. If you just ask people questions about themselves, they'll like you a lot more.
Turns out, really like me.
Love you. It turns out if you ask them a whole bunch of questions about themselves, you'll learn a whole lot, and they'll like you a lot more. And that's really there's really some magic in that. It's not rocket science, but there is something really special about learning from as many people as you can, every opportunity you can. And for people that are in the process of expanding their own education, this is the perfect time for that.
Feels like a good spot to end. So I guess we will wrap up here. We have recorded this, so we'll also send it out to you guys, so you can look back if you want to refer to anything. Thank you so much for being with us, Robert. It's awesome to have you.
This is great, and I wish you all the best of luck.